Hey everybody, my name is Tim Stratton. I'm with Freethinking Ministries, and it's awesome to have you with us, whether you're watching on Facebook Live or watching the video later, or if you're here in this classroom. I'm just glad that you're here with me. And today we're going to continue our lesson on the providence of God. You know, how is it that the Bible can teach two different things as truth, but at face value, it looks like these two biblical truths are in contradiction. And if they're in logical contradiction, then they can't both be true. So it seems that the Bible teaches two things. One, that God is in control of all things. And two, that humans are free and responsible for some things. So how does that work? If God is in control of all things, how can we be in control of some things? Notice the all and the some. Those don't seem to make sense. But can they both be true? I think they can. I don't think there's a logical contradiction here. Well, let's continue where we left off. We learned that before God creates a world, and by before, what philosophers and theologians will say is logically prior. All right, so when I use the word before God creates the universe, I mean logically prior, okay? For those of you out there that are sticklers on using the correct words, okay? But we learned that before God creates a world, or logically prior to God's creative decree, let there be, boom, right? Before God creates, via his decree, God has natural knowledge, right? There's a theological term for you. God possesses natural knowledge. This means that he knows what must be true and what could be true. Now, think about the Kalam cosmological argument, right? We studied that a few weeks ago. If you missed it, you can find that lesson on the website here. But think about the Kalam cosmological argument. When we study the Kalam, we see that the creator of the universe, God, the creator or the cause of the universe, is in this state where things don't happen. I call it a static state, that God exists in this static state of aseity. Because God created time. He made the clock start to tick. Well, before the clock started ticking, God exists. And the clock isn't ticking. So think about that. So the Kalam gives us a picture, if you will, of God existing in the state of affairs in which nothing else exists, and logically prior to his decree to create the universe and anything else. Right? So God exists in the static state of aseity. Now here's the question. In this state, is God maximally great? In this state, is God maximally great? So, with the Kalam in mind, we get this picture of God, if you will, use picture loosely, and we just ask, is God omnipotent in this state? And is God omniscient in this state? And is God omnibenevolent in this state? Is God a maximally great being? So, in this state of affairs, God knows what must be true and what could be true. This means that God knows all possible worlds. Now, given the fact that God's omnipotent in this state, think about the word omnipotent. Omnipotent. Potent, right? What does potent mean? Power, or God has the ability. Potent, potency, potential. God can do things. He can do different things. And since he's omnipotent, he has a choice of different things he has the power to do. God's omnipotent. He's all powerful. Now, so if God knows everything that he could do, this means that God knows all the different possible worlds that he could make actual. So if you remember, these represent possible worlds, okay? Now there would be, some would say an infinite amount of these. I don't think you need an infinite, but there would be way more than than just these, but let's just suppose that God knows that he's got these options of possibilities. These circles, they just mean possible worlds or possibilities that he could do if he wanted to, if he chose to, right? And God doesn't have to create anything else. He's perfectly fine in his static state of aseity as a trinity. Okay, we studied the Trinity a few weeks ago too. I encourage you to watch that video if you haven't seen it yet. But he's perfectly perfect in that state. He doesn't need creation. But God knows everything that he could do. Even if he never created, he still knew what he could do. So, I'm talking about God's natural knowledge right now, what he could do. Now, in this state of aseity, he also possesses middle knowledge. There's another theological term that you've got to grasp. Middle knowledge. The main difference between middle knowledge and natural knowledge is the difference between could and would. Okay? God knows everything that he could do, and then he knows that if he created these other worlds that he could create, he knows what would occur in those worlds if he chose to create them, even if he never chooses to create them. Right? This is middle knowledge. Now, if God is all-powerful, then he has the power to create creatures in which he does not always causally determine everything about them. Right? He's got the power to create free agents. And when I use the word free, I mean genuine freedom in a libertarian sense. There's another theological/philosophical word. We're talking about genuine freedom, or what we call libertarian free will, where a creature is free to act, and nothing else is forcing or causing that creature to act one way or the other. So we're talking about, if God's all-powerful, then he has the power to create free creatures. To deny that is to say, God does not have that power, and thus he's not omnipotent. Now, in that state of affairs, if God has the power to do that, to create a free creature, if he's omniscient and knows all things, then God would know how that free creature would freely choose, even logically prior, before God creates that world with that free creature. Right? Are you tracking with me? If God's omnipotent, he has the power to create a world of free creatures, and if he's omniscient, he knows what those free creatures, or how those free creatures would freely choose if he creates them, even if he never creates them. So if one believes that God is that God existed, if you will, to use temporal language, in a static state of aseity, right? Without anything else in existence because God created everything else. And if one likes the Kalam cosmological argument, you have a good understanding of that view. If one affirms that God existed in a static state of aseity, and that God is omnipotent, and that God is omniscient, if you affirm all of those things, I don't see how you cannot affirm at least some flavor of Molinism. If you deny one of those things, you're on thin ice. You might be a heretic. I don't know. I'm willing to have that conversation. But if you affirm that God existed in a state in which the universe did not exist or anything else because he created everything else, and if you affirm that God is omniscient and omnipotent in that state, I think you're left with Molinism. Now let's continue talking about this view. God has middle knowledge. He knows things that would be true in certain situations, even if those situations never came to exist. So, for example, he knows what someone would freely do in any situation. Let's consider some scripture. And let's go to Acts 17. Let's go 26 here. 26 and 27, maybe 28. All right, let me read it for you. Talking about God. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined, now pay attention to what God determines here, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. That's all he's determining. Okay? I'm not saying that God never determines anything. Okay, but here we go. Let me continue. Having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. You see, the Bible's clear there that God determines certain things, your existence, when and where you live, but it does not logically follow then, or even biblically follow, that he determines everything about you, including all of your thoughts, your actions, your beliefs, and your behaviors. Some of those things are actually up to you. It doesn't say that they will find God, that they might, that they should, and they might is the language used there. Now, are there Bible verses that have a flavor of determinism? Yeah. Are there Bible verses that have a flavor of free will, libertarian free will? You better believe it. We cannot turn our backs on any of these scriptures. We must have a view that makes sense of all of them, at least if we're going to say the Bible's true. Because truth and logic are inextricably linked. You can't have one without the other. And so, to affirm logical incoherence is a nice way of saying, hey, the Bible's not true. But if you are going to affirm that the Bible's true, then you must not make logically incoherent statements. It's fine to appeal to mystery, that's one thing. But you cannot make logically incoherent statements. Make one statement and then make statement X and then make statement Y, and having those two statements be in logical contradiction with each other, or if they're mutually exclusive is what we say. So we got to be careful as Christians. So God knows what someone would freely do in any situation. If God chooses to create a world with certain people, he can only create a world where they freely do things that they actually would choose to do. So even though God knows all possible worlds, he can create only some of them. So if you remember, I think we talked about this in the last video, there's a whole bunch of possible worlds, things which are logically possible. So, for example, it's logically possible that Abraham Lincoln stands on his head to deliver the Gettysburg Address. Right? Is there any logic? It's crazy to think about, right? But just because something's crazy doesn't mean it's incoherent. So it's possible. A possible world exists in which Abraham Lincoln stands on his head to deliver the Gettysburg Address. But if God gives freedom to creatures, and I say there's at least three very important reasons why God would want humans to possess libertarian free will, and I'll get to that later. But if God gives libertarian free will to creatures, even though it's possible for Abraham Lincoln to freely choose to stand on his head, if free will really means free will and it's not some word game, then if Abraham Lincoln never freely chooses to stand on his head to deliver the Gettysburg Address, can God create a world where Abraham Lincoln freely chooses to stand on his head to deliver the Gettysburg Address? No. So even though it's a possible world, let's say this is the possible world where Abraham Lincoln stands on his head to deliver the Gettysburg Address, if he never freely chooses to do it, then God can't create a world where Abraham Lincoln freely chooses to do it. Therefore, then this world doesn't exist for God to actualize. Right? So it's not a feasible world, even though it's a possible world. That's deep, I know, but hang with me. I think we're going to figure it out. So there's a whole bunch of possible worlds, and then it funnels down into a smaller subset of worlds that God can actually create if he gives humans free will. So if he gives humans free will, or creates a world in which he does not causally determine everything, all things all the time, then that list of possible worlds, which is logically possible, funnels down into a smaller subset. So, we could get rid of a whole bunch of these other worlds. They're not available for God to actually actualize. All right, let's just say, we'll just get 3 of them for now. All right. So, those get whittled down, and then actually, of these feasible worlds, God chooses one of them and makes it the actual world. So let's just say that then this is the actual world that you live in, right? We know that we're living in the actual world. We're not a possible world because we actually exist. So, let me say it one more time. Natural knowledge is everything that God knows could happen. Middle knowledge is everything that God knows about what would happen if he were to actualize a world. Then God creates, okay? So we've got logical moments here. And those are broken down into 3 logical moments of God's knowledge. That's just the way we speak to help us understand God knows everything that could, would, and will happen. And we have to use the word logically prior because we're talking about a state of affairs in which the clock is not ticking. And so to use words like before, we're stuck with, when we're speaking English anyway. Since we're stuck with English, I am anyway, that's why I have to do this a lot, or trying to explain things. If I use language that assumes time when time didn't really exist. I've written a lot about that on freethinkingministries.com if you'd like to take a look. And one of our colleagues on Freethinking Ministries, his name is Dr. Erasmus. Take a look at some of his work, even in the published literature. And he has, he's a metaphysician and has done some really good work on God and time. Anyway, so you've got everything that God knows that could happen is natural knowledge. What would happen is middle knowledge. And then in between middle knowledge and then what is called free knowledge, there's a creative act. So God steps in. This isn't a logical moment of knowledge. This is an act of God. Okay? So there's what could happen, what would happen, an act of God, and now what will happen. And that's called free knowledge. And this is the actual world, the world that actually exists. Now God knows what, in this world, what free creatures will freely choose. And again, it's important to note that just because God knows what one will freely choose, it does not entail that it's not freely chosen. I'll talk about that more later. God knows what will freely happen. That means there's no strings attached, at least occasionally. There's no natural strings, like physics isn't forcing me to do everything. Physics and chemistry isn't forcing me to think all of my thoughts, right? And there's no supernatural strings attached either. God knowing what you will freely do doesn't force you to do it. Knowledge doesn't stand in causal relation any more than an infallible weather barometer would cause the rain in Spain. Right? Knowledge does not cause things. But given God's knowledge, he can predestine things or elect things to happen without making them happen, or what we call causally determining them to happen. Now, again, logically speaking, once, to use temporal language, once God knows which world he can create, or which worlds he can create, then he chooses to create one of those worlds. Now listen to this. It's up to God to choose which one of these worlds to create. Right? It's not up to me. It's not up to you guys. It's not up to you. Right? It's up to God what world to create. And this is where we get predestination and election. God can only create one of these worlds because a world includes everything, all of his creation. So, not just our planet, the entire galaxy and heaven and hell, if God has created other universes, which I don't think he probably has, but if he did, I'm open to it. If God created other universes, that's all included in the word world here. Okay, all of his creation. So God can only create one world because it just includes everything he's created. It's everything. Okay, again, logically, once God chooses to create a world, he now knows what will happen in the world. This is called God's free knowledge. So, again, that includes everything that you will freely choose. I'll say it one more time. Just because God knows what you will freely choose does not entail that it was not freely chosen. So, God's middle knowledge is called middle because it's, this is a very technical, very fancy term here. It's called middle knowledge because it's in the middle between natural and free knowledge. God knows what could, would, and will happen. And hey, I contend if you deny any of those, then you deny God's omniscience. You're denying a full view of God's omniscience. If you're going to say, in the state of affairs, in God's static state of aseity, logically prior to creation, that God did not know something, you're denying his maximal greatness. You're denying God's omniscience. Does anybody want to do that if you're a Christian? I don't think we should. So if you're ever wondering what middle knowledge is all about, middle knowledge brings the wood. Right? You got what could happen and what will happen. Middle knowledge brings the wood. If God's omniscient, he would know what would happen. And I think the Kalam, understanding the Kalam cosmological argument, helps us understand this. And in fact, a few weeks ago, I published an essay on freethinkingministries.com called The Apologetic Significance of Molinism, showing how this view of God's sovereignty has far greater access to arguments for the existence of God and defending God from attacks from non-believers. The Molinist has access to far more arguments than anyone else, than a Calvinist has, or than a Thomist has, or than the open theist has. Now, that doesn't make Molinism true, but if it's true, it gives us more in our arsenal, so to speak. And I do think it's true. Anyway, I just added a postscript. I told you in the previous video that that essay was nearly 8,000 words. I think one of the longest things I've ever written on the website anyway. And now it's way over 8,000 because I added more on how the Kalam helps us understand Molinism. So if you want to read that, it's a postscript. It's even below the footnotes at this point, and I'm going to write more about that later on. So stay tuned. How long have I been teaching for?
12:40.
Let's see. I think I'm going to stop right there, and we'll come back next week with the final part of this lesson. So think about these things. Think about the scriptures that I reference. I've got more scriptures to reference next week. But if you'd like to consider that a little more, go to my website, freethinkingministries.com, and search for an article called Molinism is Biblical. A lot of times people say, hey, this is just a philosophy, and you're trying to press it on Scripture. Well, really, all these competing views are philosophies. That people are examining the Scriptures and trying to make the best sense of them. And I contend that Molinism does that better than any other view. Come back next week, and I'll wrap it up, and I'll really try to explain that. Hey, have a great week. I'll see you then.